overall companies are very vested in their employees and the well-being of their employees. What is a life worth? From that perspective, I don't think that you can put rate of return on how much an employee is worth and how much you're going to spend to protect that life.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Relocation Leader. I'm your host, Zach Turbis, and today we have Stephanie Hancock, the Global Client Relations Administrative Team Manager for NEI Global Relocation. Welcome,
Yes.
Stephanie.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Zach.
So today we are talking about duty of care. And for all those who don't know what duty of care is, would you give a brief synopsis so that we know what we're talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So duty of care is really a legal obligation which requires adherence to a standard of regulations, reasonable care, whether an employee is on company grounds, they're on assignment, or they're traveling for the company.
So I feel like, when we're talking relocation, this is not top of mind normally. I mean, you have like policy dynamics, how to optimize programs, and then space bar, somewhere down there is duty of care.
Yes.
But, why should companies, not be pass over this?
I think it's really important for companies to keep in mind duty of care because it is not something that is important to one particular piece of a company. It's important to everything within the company. And it goes from small practices to large procedures. So having duty of care in mind with everything that is being considered is something that is really going to be best for not only the company, but for its employees.
How has the concept of duty of care evolved? I imagine that, in the past, it was something like people were aware that they had obligations to look after their employees if they're on assignment and stuff like that. But, as certain scenarios, people encounter certain scenarios, the scope sort of broadens. Could you explain sort of the evolution of duty of care and how companies see that?
Yeah, absolutely. So events like September 11th, various hurricanes, COVID-19, all of these things have made it abundantly clear that companies need to be prepared to take action when these types of events come up. Sometimes they are going to have warning and sometimes they're not going to have warning. So having procedures in place for any of these items that can take a company by surprise is going to end up being best practice.
Is there any change in practices that you notice during those, I guess, punctuated bouts of upheaval?
Mm-hmm. I think the main change of practice is really the preparation for their employees. So when individuals are getting ready to go on an assignment or they are traveling, it's really important for companies to prepare those individuals for things that could happen. So really understanding what their resources are if they do have any kind of a medical emergency, if there is an emergency that takes place from an environmental standpoint, what exactly they need to do so they're not caught up in that trying to wonder what to do at the last minute, trying to get a hold of someone who may not be prepared for them to call.
Nice. So I'm thinking about, a major event happens in the world. Maybe I'm a corporate contact, a mobility manager in HR. My first question to myself is, what do I do? Who do I call?
Sure.
Can you take that and tell me, sort of walk me through the procedure and when something happens like that, what is to be done?
Sure, absolutely. So it really depends on what kind of resources your company has set up. So if they are going to be working with a third party to provide additional services, if there is something that comes up like a medical emergency and evacuation is necessary, or transportation to a medical facility not in the immediate area, those employees need to know, again, who to contact at that point in time. So having those phone numbers and the contracts set up already with that third party and the company is important. If there is a mobility program that is involved, being able to provide all of that information to the mobility contact as well, because they are so involved in where those employees are and what's going on in their assignment or relocation, that they can get in contact with the correct people right away as well. So really having all of those procedures up to date and trained is important.
The prep work that goes into briefing all the relocating employees as far as like, this is maybe an area that is prone to experiencing certain either disasters or, other things. There is some involvement there with the RMC, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's even more important to have the full line of communication when a company is sending their employee to an area that could be considered more of a hardship type location or something that has to do with safety. Some things that a company can do even to help offset that before anything does happen is really working with their partners to make sure that if they're providing housing, that those corporate facilities have been vetted, that they're in a safe area, that they are available to be able to withstand any sort of issue that may come up if there is a weather issue or if there is, God forbid, any kind of a war or attack on that area, that those things have all been taken into consideration.
How often is it that a client comes to you and says, hey, we're worried about these things. Can you look into it, help provide some guidance versus, maybe they have a move scheduled and it's the RMC approaching the client and saying, hey, you might want to consider X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, it does not happen as often as you think. But again, it really depends on the locations of that company. If they know that they are in an area that could potentially have issues arise, then they are going to be more in tune to having procedures set up prior to an event happening.
Are there any instances, in your recent past where you've had to work with a client through various duty of care related issues? And could you maybe explain how that went without using the client's name?
Sure. Sure. I think one of the most recent experiences really was with Hurricane Katrina. And in that event, the company needed to evacuate many of their employees. So working with that company and with our corporate housing providers was something that was really key, because availability for housing was extremely limited, as you can imagine. So working together to find that housing, working with the employees to make sure that they had the resources that they needed to be able to get to that new location. And then really after the fact, knowing what was needed by the company, they did a great job of setting up just an emergency hotline, making sure that that was available. They had a care fund in case something else came up that individuals weren't expecting or another event happened. They had that resource to draw from.
So just to satisfy my own curiosity,
yes,
could you explain what who some of these third-party providers are, and sort of what's the range of helps that they offer these individuals who are in these different situations?
Sure. So there are a variety of companies. If we're looking at the duty of care specific type companies, International SOS is one that is kind of a leader in the industry that will help with evacuations, with medical assistance. They really have a wide range of services that they offer, which is negotiated with the companies themselves in their contracts. Specifics among that, I really can't get into, just because we haven't had to go into that level of detail with them.
Nice. And so this is a very important question. I hope you're ready for it. If you had to pick a superhero that would be best at duty of care, which one would you pick and why?
Oh my goodness. I have to go with Superman.
Yeah.
I mean, he's going to fly
kinda the
in
obvious
there.
choice.
Yep. He's going to fly in there and he's going to pull them out and be able to protect those employees to the best of his ability, which is pretty
Now,
wide.
see, what my immediate thought was like Nightcrawler, because
Okay.
he can teleport, and that's even faster than flying, you know?
Okay. True.
But I'm pretty sure he had to see the location beforehand, you know, or else he can't
Yeah.
go there. And so, like, it kind of all fell apart at that point.
Okay.
So maybe,
I like the thought process, though.
yeah. So I think you're still correct,
Okay,
you know,
good.
but I'm glad we got over that hurdle. All right. So we've, talked about some of the extreme events,
Yes.
happenings that occur that companies will try and troubleshoot and figure out with that third party and prepare for ahead of time with the
Yes.
RMC. What about some of those not so extreme events? What still falls under the duty of care umbrella that companies should be aware of?
Yeah. So there can be a variety of events that happen that don't have to get to that critical level. Some of them are relatively minor. If you have a cleaner coming in and they're mopping the floor, having a wet floor sign is an example of duty of care. That's something that could have an employee injured if that sign wasn't there. So that's one example. Companies doing their best to make sure that they are informing their employees of exits, having fire drills, tornado drills, all of those types of things are relatively minor, relatively routine, however, can make a big impact if the event happens. And then other things that you may not necessarily consider, but technology, that's something that is duty of care, making sure that your employees know what phishing scams are, what to look out for, what malware is. All of those security type training items are really important to keep not only the company secure, but also keep an employee's information protected.
Everything you just mentioned sounds so uninteresting.
Yes.
And yet, if any of those things happen, it could be very detrimental to the experience.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
So how does a client, a company, ensure that everything goes right then?
I don't know that there is a way to ensure everything goes right.
That most things go right.
However, I do think that their practices are going to speak for themselves. For example, there is a company that I read about that their practice was not necessarily to inform their employees about where fire extinguishers were. Something relatively minor. This company was in a large building and an employee set a fire inadvertently, didn't know how to find the extinguisher to put it out, ended up having to call 911 as the fire grew. The entire building was evacuated. But because there were employees that were on a higher level floor, they did go to the stairwell. And as they were going down, the firemen were going up and they were told to stay where they were. The firemen went into the area that had the fire set, and those doors were self-locking. So in other words, the employees that were in the firewall got stuck within the firewall. They could not get out. They called 911. Again, nobody came to their rescue. 6 employees ended up perishing.
Oh, no.
Over that one small incident. Had a company taken the time to make sure their employees were trained, all of it could have been avoided. Companies need to consider that as well as potential lawsuits. So from a financial standpoint, they really can have a big impact aside from what value an employee's life is worth.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of potential impacts to decisions.
I'm kind of thinking organizationally now, I felt like if somebody was like, hey, Zach, I want you to come up, we're exposed in all these potential areas that I don't know about. And so I want you to find out, how we're exposed and then how to correct, make sure that everyone knows where the fire extinguishers are, and then a list of so many other things.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like too much for one person, maybe not for ChatGPT now, but, like how can companies think about, working with their organization to be able to cover all these bases, because it can seem like a lot. If we're down to talking about signs outside of a wet hallway, there's a lot to think about.
Yes.
So like, whose job is it? How can you start, game planning? And then where does that cross lines with, global mobility?
Mm-hmm. I think documentation is always something that is really important so that everyone knows where to access all of the information. There are so many different potential departments that are involved in duty of care when it comes to legal, risk, HR, mobility. All of those areas have skin in the game, so to speak. There typically should be one overarching company or department that should really take responsibility for the duty of care, and keeping that in mind in all of the procedures and practices that are being put in place. From a mobility standpoint, it really is making sure that the company knows where their employees are, when they're traveling, when they're coming home, what transportation they have chosen. They can do that by requiring different applications to be used for travel. We at NEI use Concur. That's something that other companies have used. And then HR or mobility always knows exactly where their employees are because of that application. There are companies as well that are putting different tracking applications on company phones so that they can pinpoint down to the block, to the room where an employee is located if there is an event that happens. That's an area that mobility really should take the lead in. But again, working with other departments to make sure that everybody is on the same page and has the same type of processes in mind when they're developing those.
It's funny how many things kind of come down to communication. I feel like,
yes.
when I'm having so many, talks on these podcasts, and, I feel like you just flip a coin, the answer is going to be communication one out of every two times,
Yes.
But in this case, especially, with duty of care, it's not just about knowing the right things. It's about communicating it too.
Right. Yep, you're absolutely correct. It's if an employee doesn't know what they're supposed to do, then the chances of them doing it are pretty slim.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about making sure they're prepared ahead of time, a lot of the times, whether it's an extreme event or something that's even relatively minor, when you're in the moment, it's really hard to think about what the right thing to do is.
Yes.
Like try and remember a phone number, that is not in your phone at the right time. Like it's sometimes impossible,
Yeah.
So, equipping your employees with the tools, that's great, but really just making sure that they are aware of, all the range of possibilities of things that could happen ahead of time, so that they can already start mapping out in their mind kind of what they need to do if something would occur. And then if something does occur, they follow the map that they've already made.
Yes, absolutely. And I think duty of care even comes down to not only their physical safety and where they're at, but really also just their overall potential financial well-being, making sure from a compliancy perspective for taxes, for immigration, all of that falls under duty of care as well. Companies need to make sure that they are following the correct regulations so that they do not get in trouble, so that the employee doesn't get in trouble, so that they're paying the right taxes. There aren't, large financial impacts. All of those things fall into that bucket as well.
Nice. Is there any, I would say, misconceptions? I know we've covered so much ground already,
Right.
But is there any misconceptions that people have about duty of care, or maybe Yeah. What would you say to that?
I think that the first thought that an individual has that comes to mind for duty of care is really their physical safety.
Mm-hmm.
And what are they going to do if an emergency happens or, something environmental happens? Where are they going to go? What are they going to do? But they're looking at it from a large perspective, a grand scale.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've discussed, it goes down to the very minor items that need to be taken into consideration.
Well, even too, because, the RMC handles a lot of duty of care when, these, the employees are en route, from one place to another. That does fall under the relocation management jurisdiction,
right?
More times than not. One thing that just occurred to me, I was talking with Ginny Taylor on a previous podcast, and she was talking about how, NEI, as a philosophy, always wants to make sure that people are not ending up in a voicemail, in a voicemail box, that we can get, if somebody needs help, they can talk to a person,
Correct.
And when it comes to duty of care, I feel like that's really important.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Making sure that the phone numbers that are being given and that the resources that are being provided to make sure that someone can connect when needed are available 24/7. And I think the companies that really have that authority over evacuation, things like that, are prepared and ready for those calls at 3:00 in the morning. They're going to be providing their information so that it is something where an individual can get a hold of them at any time. NEI is another one. We're providing our home phone numbers, mobile contact information, all of those things. So if there's an emergency and a company doesn't necessarily have something in place right away, our account executives, our client relations managers, and our senior leaders are available.
I remember when I first learned that the AEs, that their home numbers were given out or their mobile numbers were given out, and it's like, oh, so you could just call them anytime,
Anytime.
they're like with a proper reason, for sure.
Right.
But like, I thought that was so unique. Like, that's, I think that's exceptional, all right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about budgets. So, we're talking about duty of care. If somebody was like, I've sort of understood a little bit about this topic, but not a lot. You're explaining a lot to me. I do value people, but how much is this going to cost me? I'm just curious. So how should people think about this in terms of their budget? And should ROI and duty of care ever be mentioned in the same breath?
I think it's something that's important to mention in the same breath when it comes to, again, the value of your employees. What is a life worth? From that perspective, I don't think that you can put a rate of return on how much an employee is worth and how much you're going to spend to protect that life.
Or the ROI is always going to be positive.
Yes, exactly. But you also have to consider, if that's not taken into consideration, as I have said before, what happens if a company ends up in a lawsuit? That could potentially cost a lot more than spending the potential other money for protection. Looking at taxes, we had talked about taxation and compliance regulations, all of those being a part of duty and care. All of those come with legal fees. So building some of that into your budget to make sure that you have that protection for your employees is going to be important. But we also don't want to really have to go above and beyond to budget for something that you're going to be paying for and be protected from with those relocation management companies' assistance and tax providers' assistance, visa and immigration.
Yeah. It's like striking a balance, like with anything.
Exactly.
Yeah. And especially to, paying for the knowledge. If you need some help figuring that out, finding somebody who does this,
Yes.
who knows exactly what to do for those companies. It'll pay you back. You may not I feel like what you said about legal fees, and if something were to happen, that stuff is very costly versus just paying for somebody who's done it before, who can tell you exactly what to communicate and how to set things up. You have to trust the process in a lot of ways.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So, we talked about some of the extreme crazy examples. We talked about some of the not so crazy examples. Maybe we touched on this a little bit, but, when we're talking about the aftermath of a traumatic event, potentially. So it's not just when you've removed somebody from a dangerous or traumatic situation that we're all good, right?
Correct.
How do we deal with employee well-being after we've sort of cleared the hurdle of the initial traumatic event?
Right, absolutely. I think having those employee assistance programs in place for your employees is going to be very important. They need to be able to have resources to either help from a physical standpoint or help from a mental standpoint, because there is going to be trauma involved. From a family perspective, having students be able to go to their schools, to be able to go to counseling, those types of things are always going to be helpful as well.
Nice. So kind of lastly, duty of care, as you mentioned with the fire escapes and stuff like that, it can be a pretty heavy topic sometimes, and you're talking about risk. There's a lot of potential dangers and stuff like that. How can companies think about duty of care in a positive sense? How can we think about the many positive aspects of thinking through these things?
Sure, absolutely. I think that overall companies are very vested in their employees and the well-being of their employees. And this all has to go into how their employees are going to be within the company. It becomes a company culture, and it's something that is automatically built in to your processes and to an employee's thought, really frame of mind, as they are proceeding with all of the things that they're doing as an employee for the company. So it just makes it easier as an employee to do the best job possible if they feel as if their company is doing what's best for them.
All right. A few silly questions. I don't know if these will make it, but what's the best sport?
The best sport?
The best sport.
Oh my goodness.
There's a right and a wrong answer too. I'll let you know. Yeah.
Oh goodness. Okay, I know it's becoming cliche, but I'm going to have to go with volleyball just because both of my girls play. It's something that is really becoming a very prevalent sport. And not only is it something that is for women, but men's volleyball is starting to come up in line as well. So it's something for everyone.
I remember back when I was in college watching the Olympics men's volleyball. I think it was in Beijing, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember.
There was one.
Yeah, I think it was Beijing. But I was like, goodness, dude, this is like an NBA basketball team. Like they were so tall and crazy, very athletic. I definitely probably wouldn't do that well there. But the correct answer is baseball.
I knew you were going to say that. That was my second choice, I will say.
It's all right.
I've got a family that's from Illinois and cards for Missouri. So
yeah. See, the nice thing about baseball is like not only is it just an exceptional sport in general, but for style points, that's what really gets you over the hump. Okay. Thank you guys for joining us for another episode of Relocation Leader, and we will see you back in 2 weeks.